Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the war in Vietnam. So just a little bit of background to the war. France had actually controlled what was then called Indochina, which we today call Vietnam, since the late 1800s. It was one of their colonies and they had called it Indochina. Well, during World War II, Japan took over that from the French. And then what happens is that following this, the U.S. tries to help France get back Indochina. That fails, and what happens is that Vietnam gets split up into two. And you're going to have North Vietnam and South Vietnam. So what ends up happening is that with North Vietnam, they're going to become communist, and South Vietnam is going to set up a democratic government. And the U.S. is going to try and keep that because, once again, the U.S., following World War II, is all about stopping the spread of communism. And so Eisenhower comes up with this theory, and it's called the domino theory. And basically what he said is that if one country becomes communist, then the next country by it will become communist. And he said it's like dominoes. So if you ever played dominoes, you know, where you set them up, or if you ever watched it and then you hit one and it starts this huge chain reaction. That's basically what he was saying, but he's saying that's how countries will be with communism. So he is like, hey, our whole policy, our whole goal is to stop the spread of communism, so we can't let a single one become communist. So that's just a little background on the war. We're going to watch a video which is going to cover the war in Vietnam.
This was the longest war in the history of the United States. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be learning more about the Vietnam War. As part of the Cold War, the Vietnam War was a struggle against communism and an effort to limit its expansion.
If this little nation goes down the drain and can't maintain her independence, ask yourself what's going to happen to all the other little nations.
In 1954, Vietnam was split into two zones at the Geneva Conference. In North Vietnam was the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which was a communist state led by Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam was non-communist, and its first president was Ngo Dinh Diem. By mid-1955, Diem initiated a campaign denouncing communism. Suspected communist activities were punished with jail time and even death. His regime lost popularity to the point where a significant portion of South Vietnam supported the communists. This prompted a guerrilla campaign to pop up in the South in late 1956. Named the National Liberation Front, this movement was more commonly called the Viet Cong. As directed by Ho Chi Minh, they used armed propaganda to fight their battles. This targeted violence was initially aimed at politicians, but grew more widespread in the hopes of unifying the country under one communist regime. In an effort to limit the expansion of communism into neighboring countries, the United States began training forces in the South towards the end of the 1950s.
It's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it. We can help them. We can give them equipment. We can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it, the people of Vietnam, against the communists.
At this time, with support from the U.S. government, a coup was being discussed to overthrow Diem. However, Diem was executed during the coup on November 2, 1963, without approval from the Americans. His death caused the political climate in the South to destabilize, and each new government toppled quickly. In August 1964, two alleged attacks on American warships were reported off North Vietnam's coast in the Gulf of Tonkin. This gave the U.S. the ammunition necessary to get more heavily involved in the conflict. That year, the number of U.S. troops deployed had risen to 16,500 from only 2,000 a few years earlier. The war escalated, and in March 1965, a series of aerial bombing attacks by U.S. and Vietnamese forces against North Vietnam commenced and continued for 3 years. During that period, Operation Rolling Thunder dropped 1 million tons of missiles, rockets, and bombs on the North. With support from the American public, the U.S. ground war also began in March '65. 3,500 Marines were sent to the South for a defensive mission, and by December, that number had risen to 200,000. However, the ARVN forces of the South experienced great losses in a number of battles over the next few months, and morale dropped. The United States then decided they must intervene even further in order to win the war. Prior to this, they had insisted it was up to the Vietnamese to end things. President Lyndon Johnson and his administration tried to spin the war and its progress in the American media by highlighting stories that showed the war's progression.
All the challenges have been met. The enemy is not beaten, but he knows that he has met his master in the field.
This made the media and the public mistrustful of the government. The Tet Offensive proved to the Americans that progress was not in fact being made. On January 31st, 1968, the VCs made a surprise attack on the Southern Vietnamese and Americans. They responded quickly and effectively. However, the fight raged for months and killed President Johnson's chances of re-election.
I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country.
By the time he left office, approximately 30,000 American lives had been lost fighting in Vietnam. When President Richard Nixon entered office in 1969, he began withdrawing troops. The policy called Vietnamization was put in place and was meant to help prepare the ARVNs to take over the battle. Amid even more attacks, U.S. public support plummeted further, especially after the National Guard killed 4 student protesters at Kent State University. Peace protests became commonplace on American soil by 1972, and the Vietnam War became a central issue in that year's presidential campaigns. After Nixon's re-election, he was able to negotiate an agreement that ended American involvement in the war.
A ceasefire, internationally supervised, will begin at 7 p.m. this Saturday, January 27, Washington time. Within 60 days from this Saturday, all Americans held prisoners of war
throughout Indochina will be released.
Signed January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords resulted in a ceasefire throughout the country and the release of American prisoners of war. However, fighting between the Vietnamese states continued until 1975. On April 30, 1975, the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon was taken. The war was over, and communist governments took over Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos.
And so that was just a little bit of an overview of the war in Vietnam. And so I just want to kind of go over some of the important stuff that the video talked about, making sure you understand it. So the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, basically what this did was, it was a way for the United States to get into the war in Vietnam without war being officially declared. So war was never actually declared. Remember, Congress has to declare war, and that never happened. So it's not really a war per se. It was just us, the U.S., sending in troops. So war was never declared. What the Gulf of Tonkin resolution did was it basically offered Johnson what they call like a blank check. Basically, the Congress is like, hey, do whatever you need to do to take care of this, but without starting a war. So it'd be like if your mom or dad or someone sent you to the grocery store with their debit card and was like, hey, get whatever you need to make it. That's basically what happened. And this just kind of shows you the deployment of U.S. troops in Vietnam. As time went through, you can see, starting in the 1960s, the numbers of troops. And by 1968, that had escalated. From 1965 to 1968, we really have a huge ground war going on in Vietnam. There's not really any territorial goals. It's not like we're going to take over this area or we want this country. The thing with Vietnam is that it's never actually about all-out warfare. It's not like we're going to go in and conquer. The U.S. couldn't do that because China was helping to back North Vietnam, just like they had with Korea. And the fear was that if China got involved, then the Soviet Union wouldn't get involved, and we would end up with World War III. The other big thing that happens is that this is going to be the first time that the media is actually out with the troops. So you're going to be seeing these live reports that are coming onto the television every night. These reporters were out with the military. They were on these missions, like you can see from this picture right here. And so they experienced this war, and it was all being televised. So every night when Americans turned on the TV, what they saw was the real atrocities and like bad things about war. They saw people getting killed. They saw the amount of people that were being killed. They saw the death numbers. Like every night the TV would say, this is how many servicemen have died. This is where we're at as far as deployment. And what this did, because for the first time it really brings home the war every single night to Americans, you begin to see as more and more men are deployed over to Vietnam, and you see more and more people being killed, that in the United States, Americans begin to question whether or not the United States should be in Vietnam. And you start to see a backlash against Vietnam. And this is really going to start, especially with the youth on college campuses, but it's going to also take effect in mainstream homes in the United States. There's also an air war during this time. This is going to be called Operation Rolling Thunder. What this basically is that for 3 years, there was non-stop bombing, especially along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. One of the things that they're going to use a lot is Agent Orange. You're going to have a lot of downed pilots who will become prisoners of war, or POWs. And like I said, you're also going to have carpet bombing, which uses napalm. And so this picture is just showing, this is the after effects. You can see the jungle on fire. It would literally burn the clothes off of people. It was using gas and chemical warfare against people, and especially you can see these are children that are being affected by it. So one of the big things that we find with Vietnam is because there was guerrilla forces and because it had these grassroots, or like within the people beginning, where a lot of people in South Korea weren't happy with the government, that U.S. troops have a hard time telling who the enemy is. How do you decide who it's going to be? The other thing is the Tet Offensive. What this is basically, it's this huge battle that takes place, and the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong attack the South at the same time. It's a huge attack. They take every major southern city, but then the U.S. is actually able to take back these places, beat them back, take the offensive. They actually destroy a lot of the Viet Cong. But what happens is that the media shows the body counts, and the media shows how nothing has been gained. And so in the United States, back at home, it's actually seen as a defeat, and it's seen as another reason to begin to pull out of Vietnam, which is beginning to become what people are asking for. Some of the impacts of the Tet Offensive, people in the U.S. are just angry. They don't trust anyone anymore. They're, especially President Johnson. You would hear protesters saying, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? It was a very popular chant during the time, trying to get people to the U.S. to pull out. It's really going to impact having the United States pull, the beginnings of people in the United States wanting us to pull out of Vietnam. President Johnson's popularity drops by a ton during this time period. You can see this is a propaganda poster making fun of Johnson's Great Society, considering what's happening in Vietnam. One of the other big things, impacts, is going to be that Johnson does not run for re-election because of what happens. Richard Nixon is going to run on the platform of saying that he's going to get the United States out of Vietnam. The morale of the troops begins to drop. When we look at the numbers of troops that are drafted, we see that there is the number of minorities and poor people is in huge contrast. There's a lot bigger representation, or a lot bigger percentage of them in comparison to non-minorities. There's a lot of racial problems that were happening. A lot of drugs were being used. A lot of soldiers were facing substance abuse.
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there telling me I've got to beware. I think it's time we stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
So I always like to play just a little bit of that song. You see with music in the late 1960s, early 1970s, a lot of it is focused on protesting the government, especially in the mid to late 60s. And a lot of anti-war demonstrations begin to happen in the 1960s, the later 1960s. And these are going to be mostly student-based, like college campuses, but others also who are protesting the war. Some of the big areas this is going to happen: Columbia University, you can see the pictures, the National Guard against the students. In California, on Berkeley's campus, Kent State, and you're going to see throughout the United States these anti-war demonstrations by students and by musicians, as musicians write protest music. You start seeing a lot of these types of buttons that are coming out, protesting the war. This is, these are draft cards. People would burn draft cards. You heard the chant, "Hell no, we won't go," as students are protesting the war. Most of the protests, a lot of them were fine. You didn't see any scuffling, but you do have protests where you have clashes between the authority figures and the demonstrators themselves. And this is going to lead to what happens at Kent State University. This happens on May 4th of 1970. There's an anti-war demonstration going on. What ends up happening is the National Guard opens fire, and 4 students are killed. 11 other students are wounded. At Jackson State University, less than a week later, 2 more students are going to be killed and 12 are going to be wounded. So these anti-war demonstrations weren't always peaceful, and we see the tensions rising as the United States continues with the war. As I was saying before, Nixon is going to campaign on the promise to end the war. He's going to call it peace with honor, basically saying we can still maintain our honor, we can have our dignity and pull out. We can have peace and still have honor. He's going to basically say that he's calling out or looking at what is called the Great Silent Majority. He says most of the people want out. They're not in these demonstrations, but the majority of Americans want out. They just don't want to be overly vocal about it. However, we will see the expansion of what's called the Secret War, which takes place in Cambodia and in Laos. We're still seeing issues from this Secret War in both those places, especially in Laos. Lots of landmines still that are there left over. Once again, Agent Orange, so we see a lot of problems still from the chemical warfare that the United States was using. Some of the big impacts of the Vietnam War. First off, the 26th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. What this said was that 18-year-olds, they lowered the age of voting. Before the Vietnamese War, you had to be 21 to vote. Following it, you could be voting at 18. The reason for this was that during those student presentations, people would say, hey, if we're old enough to go and fight for our country and die for our country, then we're old enough to make the decisions on who is representing us in the country. And Congress agreed, and so that's why you can now vote at 18. Nixon will abolish the mandatory draft, make an all-volunteer army. You have the War Powers Act of 1973 that says that presidents have to notify Congress within 48 hours of deploying a military force, and that the president has to remove those forces unless he gets congressional approval within 90 days. The idea being not to have another Vietnam where the U.S. just keeps sending more and more troops in without any goals. The other big impact we see with the Vietnam War is that there was a real disregard of the vets who returned. Veterans returning from Vietnam were not treated well at all. In fact, a lot of times you'll see that they were bullied. They weren't given the respect that they were due as veterans. A lot of people in the U.S. are going to blame the vets for the war in Vietnam. And so what we see is this real turning against veterans on a lot of areas in the United States. And when we get to the Persian Gulf War, we're going to see that a complete change in that. And what we'll see is, even though there's going to be protests against the Persian Gulf War, people who are protesting the war are going to be like, we support our vets. We support our vets. And that's going to be, even today, you'll see the yellow stickers, the yellow ribbons, and saying how much people still support the vets because of what happened after Vietnam. The POW, missing in action, that issue still remained following Vietnam. There were still a lot of vets who were missing. Some of them were returned home. One of the most famous is Senator John McCain from Arizona. But just to kind of show you how many vets are still missing, you can see about 1,600 vets are still missing from the Vietnam War. And so that ends our overview of the Vietnam War.